If we are one, then perhaps the deepest struggle we face right now is not that some of us feel we are lost, but that we have simply forgotten. Forgotten who we are. Forgotten what we are. Forgotten that beneath the personality, beneath the conditioning, beneath the fear, there is something whole, aware, eternal, and alive. In our last episode, we looked at the current volatile events from a higher spiritual perspective. We explored how pressure, discord, and transition can actually be invitations to awakening, to see more clearly, and to choose from a place of awareness instead of reaction. But if we are one, we are not powerless observers. We are co-creators of our own experience through attention, belief, and energetic alignment. From that perspective, fear-based narratives lose power when people reclaim their own spiritual authority, their own spiritual sovereignty. Today, I want to explore a concept that has been showing up in some spiritual conversations. The idea of the mimic overlay, or what some call the mimic code. And I want to say from the very outset, I am not bringing this up to create fear. I am not bringing it up to make anyone suspicious of others. I am not bringing it up to divide people into the awake and the asleep. I'm bringing it up because for many people, whether they use this language or not, there's a very real sense that something in the human experience feels distorted, feels off, and it's now time to address it consciously and with full attention. Hi, I'm Daryl T. Johnson, a musician, a teacher, and a QHHT hypnosis practitioner. I'd like to welcome all of you to episode 28 of If We Are One. Hello, and welcome to this episode. Today I want to discuss something that has been talked about in some spiritual circles that is usually described as a kind of false or synthetic spiritual field that copies intuition, synchronicity, or guidance, opposite of the concept of resonance, which is often framed as energetic compatibility or alignment. It is referred to as the mimic overlay or the mimic code, and is viewed as something that can feel like it imitates truth without fully embodying it. So to this, the question becomes, what is that? Is it ego? Is it conditioning? Is it collective amnesia? Is it the personality mistaking itself for the whole? Or is it all of these things? I personally think it may be some combination of them. And I think the deeper invitation for all of us is to not panic, but to remember. In my humble opinion, when I hear the phrase mimic overlay, I think about the many ways consciousness can imitate itself. I think about the way people can sound wise without being embodied. The way language can sound beautiful while meaning very little. The way emotions can perform rather than be felt. The way spirituality can be used as a costume instead of a lived reality. The way a person can appear composed, polished, or enlightened while still being driven by fear, image, or unconscious repetition. That to me is one of the most important aspects of this conversation, because the mimic does not always look sinister. Sometimes it looks intelligent. Sometimes it looks spiritual. Sometimes it looks helpful. Sometimes it looks like truth, just enough to be convincing. But underneath, there is a hollowness, a lack of life, a lack of depth, a lack of presence. So when people talk about the mimic overlay, I think they are often trying to name that strange experience of encountering something that looks real, but does not quite carry the pulse, the resonance of what is real. And maybe, in a broader sense, it is a description of what happens when we live too long from the surface of ourselves. It's worth noting here that none of this is really new. What some people today call the mimic overlay or the mimic code can be understood as a modern way of describing an old spiritual theme: Maya, illusion, distortion, forgetting, and the human struggle to remember what is real. In older traditions, especially Gnostic ones, this shows up in language about the demiurge, false creation, and separation from source. Now, I'm not bringing this in to get lost in cosmology, but simply to give us a frame of reference. In other words, we're looking at an ancient conversation that is being spoken in new language for a new time. For me, this connects deeply with the idea of the veil of amnesia, because that phrase feels softer and in some ways more universal. The veil of amnesia suggests that we are not fundamentally broken. It suggests that we have simply forgotten our origin, forgotten our wholeness, forgotten that we are more than the role we are playing, forgotten that the temporary identity is not the totality of who we are. And I think that is why awakening often feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something ancient, something already known, something already there, something that was never truly absent, only obscured. That is a very different energy than fear, because if the issue is forgetting, then the solution is remembrance. And remembrance is gentle. Remembrance is patient. Remembrance does not need to attack anything. It simply shines more light. For those of you who are, like myself, Star Trek fans, I often think about the Star Trek holodeck when I try to explain this, because the holodeck is a beautiful metaphor for the human experience. Inside the holodeck, everything feels real. The characters feel real. The emotions feel real. The dangers feel real. The story itself feels real. And yet the person inside this holodeck knows it is a constructed field. They know they are participating in an experience. They know the environment is not the ultimate reality, even if it is compelling, immersive, and powerful. That, to me, is a helpful way to think about incarnation itself. Not as a lie, not as a trap, but as a field of experience where consciousness can become deeply immersed. The difference, in our case, is that we forgot we were in the holodeck. We became so identified with the role, the body, the story, the personality, and the fear that we mistook the experience for the whole of reality. So awakening is the moment we begin to remember, not necessarily all at once, not perfectly, but enough to know that the scene is not the self, the role is not the whole. The body is not the limit of who and what we are. So this is where ego and identity come into play. This is where I think the conversation becomes very practical, because the mimic overlay can be understood in part as ego identification. The ego is not evil. The ego is not the enemy. The ego is the personality construct, the identity structure that helps us function here. But when the personality thinks it is the whole self, problems begin. We start feeding into the limiting beliefs. I am my fear. I am my wound. I am my role. I am my reputation. I am my history. I am my body alone. I am this story and nothing more. And when identity becomes that narrow, life becomes smaller. Fear becomes louder. Separation becomes stronger, and the false self begins to mimic what it thinks spiritual life should look like. It can mimic peace, compassion, surrender, wisdom, but it does not have the same depth as the living presence beneath it. That's why I think it's more useful to say people are often asleep than to say they are soulless. Asleep is not a verdict. Asleep is a condition, and conditions can change. This is also where the term NPC comes into the conversation. NPC meaning a non-player character, the term taken from a character in gaming that is not controlled by a player. And I want to be careful here, because that language can be used symbolically, but it can also become cruel if we are not thoughtful. At its best, NPC describes someone who seems to be living on autopilot, someone whose responses are heavily scripted, someone who is operating from conditioning rather than presence, someone who becomes so identified with the mask he or she is wearing that the deeper witness is not very visible. This can happen in public life. This can happen in relationships. This can happen in everyday conversations. And yes, it can happen with people who seem polished, charismatic, intelligent, or even spiritual. But I do not think the healthiest takeaway is to decide that certain people have no soul. It does them a disservice, and it sets you up as one who sits in judgment. I think the healthier takeaway is that consciousness can become deeply asleep in the role. And when this happens, a person can seem hollow, repetitive, or disconnected from what is real. That's not an excuse for harmful behavior, but it is a reminder that awakening is not about superiority. It is about presence. It's about returning. It's about remembering what had been covered. You see, not everyone is meant to be rescued. One of the subtle traps in spiritual work is the savior loop. The feeling that it is my responsibility to wake everyone up. The feeling that I must explain everything. The feeling that if someone does not understand, I must try harder. The feeling that truth must be forced into another person's awareness. But if we're being honest, that does not actually help. Because if we're not careful, we start feeding a pattern of over-functioning, rescuing, and energetic exhaustion. And then the very work that was meant to liberate us becomes another form of entanglement. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to reflect truth and then step back. Sometimes the most loving thing is to trust that people have their own timing. Sometimes the most loving thing is to stop trying to open a door that is not ready to open. Remember, as soul, we live in eternity. So what's the rush? That does not mean abandoning compassion. It means honoring free will. It means respecting that remembrance cannot be forced. It has to be chosen. Another perspective I think is important is this. The overlay is not only out there, it is also inside us, also internal. It can show up as overthinking, as self-protection, as performance, as spiritual identity, as the subtle need to be right, as the need to be seen as awake, as the hidden ego that turns awakening into another image to defend. That matters because it reminds us that we cannot just point at the world and say, there is the distortion. We also have to ask, where am I still living from distortion? Where am I performing instead of being? Where am I using spiritual language to hide fear? Where am I calling something truth when it is really just familiarity? Those are humbling questions. Questions that I, at times, have had to remind myself. But they are powerful ones because the path of remembrance begins inside. The body remembers too. I also want to bring in the body here because this conversation is not only philosophical. The body matters. The nervous system matters. The breath matters. Tension matters. Trauma matters. If a person is constantly in survival mode, everything can feel more distorted. Everything can feel more urgent, more threatening. And that can make the overlay feel stronger than it is. So part of awakening is not just insight. It is embodiment. It is learning how to regulate the body, learning how to breathe, learning how to settle, learning how to let the body know that presence is safe. Because a calmer body often perceives more clearly. A calmer body is less likely to confuse intensity with truth. A calmer body is better able to feel the difference between a real signal and a mimic signal. That is practical spirituality, and it really matters. Now, one of the most important distinctions in this entire conversation is the difference between discernment and paranoia. Paranoia says everything is a threat. Paranoia says trust no one. Paranoia says the world is out to get you. Now discernment, on the other hand, says something much wiser. Discernment says, let me observe carefully. Let me feel what is true. Let me notice what is coherent. Let me notice what increases clarity, peace, responsibility, and compassion. Let me notice what drains me. Let me notice what contracts me. Let me notice what keeps me divided from myself. That is a much healthier way to work with any idea of mimic energy, overlay, or false signal. Because the real goal is not to become fearful. The real goal is to become clear. So let's talk about the veil. People often ask, if we enter into this lifetime with a veil of amnesia placed over us, then who placed the veil? And there are many ways to answer that. Some say the veil is part of the design of incarnation. Some say it is connected to systems of separation and control. Some say it arises whenever consciousness identifies too completely with form. And I think there may be truth in all of those perspectives, depending on how you are speaking. But for me, the more useful question is not always, who did this? The more useful question is, how do I wake up within it? Because if we spend all our energy trying to identify the villain, we may miss the opportunity to remember ourselves. And if the point is remembrance, then the origin story matters less than the present moment of awakening. That does not mean we ignore deeper questions. It simply means we do not let the search for blame become a substitute for liberation. I also think it's important to remember that people who seem deeply asleep are not automatically bad. They may be hurt. They may be defended. They may be conditioned. They may be afraid. They may be surviving in the only way they know how. And if we call that mimic, we should do so with humility, not contempt. Because the line between being awake and being asleep can be thinner than we like to admit. There may be moments when all of us are more present. There may be moments when all of us are more automated, or moments when all of us are clearer. There may be moments when all of us are hiding. That is why compassion matters, because awakening should not make us less human. It should make us more. So what is this really about? At its heart, I think this conversation is really about remembering. Remembering that we are not the mask, that we are not the fear. Remembering that we are not the story alone, or that consciousness is deeper than personality. Remembering that life is not just something happening to us, but something that is happening through us, that we are participating in. Remembering that we have more agency than we think, that what we focus on shapes our experience, that fear narrows the field and presence expands it. Remembering that truth does not need to shout. Remembering that what is real does not need to be forced. And remembering that the way out is not through panic, but through awareness. So, when I think about the mimic overlay, the mimic code, the veil of amnesia, the false signal, the unconscious identity, I do not think about hopelessness. I think about opportunity. I think about the invitation to become more aware, more grounded, more embodied, more compassionate, more discerning, more honest, more awake. If we are one, then perhaps awakening is not about separating ourselves from the world. Perhaps it is about seeing the world clearly enough to meet it from truth rather than fear. Perhaps it is about remembering the one behind the many. Perhaps it is about realizing that the illusion loses power when it is no longer mistaken for the whole. And perhaps the deepest spiritual work of all is simply this: to remember who we are, to live from that remembrance, and to allow that remembrance to quietly, steadily, and compassionately transform everything that it touches. So if we are one, then we are not here to be trapped by the overlay. We are here to remember beyond it. We are here to see through it. We are here to awaken within the dream. And in doing so, we help the dream become more lucid, more loving, more true, and more whole. We'll be talking more about these and other topics in future installments. And if there's anything that you would like for me to discuss, or any questions you may have about anything that I have shared, please feel free to mention it by leaving a question or a comment in the comments section. As always, if you found any of this information at all helpful, please like, subscribe, and share with others. I continue to appreciate those of you who are letting others know. And I am so moved by the growing number of souls awakening worldwide to this ongoing remembrance of who and what we are within a oneness consciousness. So as always, I send you my love. And if we are one, let's all live in peace, love, and joy.